Also joining us from Allentown, Pennsylvania, Pat Toomey, who's president of Club for Growth. Pat, welcome. What do you think? The tax proposals coming out of both the House and the Senate right now that would increase, in essence, taxes on the wealthiest. Some say that's promoting class warfare. What do you think?
Well, absolutely. That's what's going on here. I think clearly the Democratic Party now in Washington is more beholden to the most radical elements, the Netroots, the MoveOn.orgs, the George Soros guys who are funding this. And if you look at the enormous success of the Bush tax cuts, sustained economic recovery, home ownership at an all-time high, family net worths at all-time high, unemployment at remarkably low rates. This has been enormously successful, and Charlie Rangel comes out and says there's nothing in it that's worth continuing. In fact, they want a big tax increase. They're also, of course, going after big successful industries, whether it's oil, pharmaceuticals, now private equity is the latest target. The good news for America is that this kind of politics of envy just generally doesn't work very well, because most voters are more motivated by a sense of opportunity than envy. So I think the Democrats are going down the wrong road.
Julian?
Well, I agree that I think that it's wrong for Democrats to engage in class warfare. I agree that most people believe in aspirational politics rather than, as Pat was saying, the kind of envy, but kind of envy politics. But I don't think really that's what it's about. I think what Democrats are saying is simply this, that the super wealthy, say the top 10% of this country, has a lower tax burden and has a far greater share of the wealth than they did, say, 10 or even 15 years ago. And it's not a question of soaking them with a greater tax burden. It's a question of the fact that we've got major problems, whether it's the healthcare crisis, whether it's adequately funding the war in Iraq, whether it is moving towards a more sensible energy policy, major problems that are underfunded. And the question is, how do we equitably and fairly and sensibly pay for that?
Well, let me ask it this. I mean, specifically as it pertains to the AMT, the alternative minimum tax, which we all agree needs to be, something has to be done to that, or you get the 20+ million middle-class Americans who are going to get caught in this net.
Right.
Pat, how do you pay for the loss of revenue should that be repealed? We're talking tens of billions of dollars over the next decade. How do you pay for that?
Well, first of all, one statistic's worth keeping in mind: the top 40% of wage earners in America pay 98% of all income taxes. But somehow that's not enough. They need to be made to pay more. The answer with the alternative minimum tax was to repeal it. You remember when we passed the Bush tax cuts?
That's probably going to happen, but how do you pay for the loss of revenue?
You pay for it with stronger economic growth and more revenue that comes in. Remember, after the Bush tax cuts, the naysayers said we'd run massive deficits. I have to correct Julian, the current 12-month deficit looks like it's going to come in below $200 billion, which is really tiny as a percentage of our economy. In fact, revenue to the federal government is at an all-time record high. And what happens when you lower marginal tax burdens, you get stronger economic growth and more revenue, not less. So if anything, we ought to abolish the alternative minimum tax. Don't raise taxes on somebody else, but get spending under control. We're still spending way too much money, and the Democratic Congress wants to spend more than the Bush administration asked for. We don't need that kind of spending.
Julian?
Well, I think your question is exactly right, and it wasn't necessarily answered. I think the question is, when you repeal the alternative minimum tax, you will have tens, hundreds of billions of dollars that are added to the deficit. Republicans, at least under this administration, haven't cared that much whether it has been $200, $300, or even $400 billion in annual deficits. They don't seem to think that that matters very much.
Well, it's very small now.
I think it has. I think it does have. I think it crowds out private borrowing. I think it raises the possibility.
Why are interest rates near record lows?
It raises the possibility of inflation. I think that there are very many negative things to that. So I think that what Democrats are saying, which is very different from what Republicans have said, is that as we begin to cut taxes like the alternative minimum tax, we'll pay for it. Republicans never showed that discipline. Republicans increased spending by 8%, and Republicans ran up the credit card. And I disagree that I think that it's just simply added revenues from economic growth that are going to take care of the deficit.
Very quickly, Pat, I'll give you the last word.
Republicans did spend too much money, but the fact is, and it's indisputable, that the economy grew very strongly after the Bush tax cuts. Much more revenue came into the Treasury than expected. Today, the deficit is considerably smaller than the post-war average as a percentage of our economy, and it's shrinking further. We don't need a tax increase. That's the worst thing we could do right now.
All right. Good to see you both. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate it very much, Julian.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.